So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Neil Servan, Chief Research Information Officer at Great Ormond Street Hospital and FRCR UK Chief Clinical Data Officer, to give us our Day 2 keynote presentation on the use of data, information, and artificial intelligence for future pediatric drug development. Neil will also join us in our panel section in the infection sections. And thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to Day 2. My name is Neil Sebire. I'm Professor of Pediatric Pathology at Great Ormond Street Hospital, but I'm also the Chief Research Information Officer, and I run our Clinical Research and Informatics unit. And I'm really going to give an overview in this session around some of the potentials and pitfalls of using routine electronic healthcare data for research, particularly around pediatric drug development. There's no conflict of interest. I'm not going to mention any specific medications in this talk. So just to put things into context, I'm going to talk about the UK context, but I'm sure this is very similar in most countries actually. In recent years, there's been a massive increase in the interest that has been shown both by individual organisations and by governments in the potential value of the data that's locked up in the routine healthcare system. So these are some of the documents in the UK around the industrial strategy, the AI strategy, national data strategies, etc., all really stating the potential value of unlocking the data that is within the healthcare system. And within our organisation, and again, this is going on in many healthcare organisations worldwide, there's been a huge change from us having loads of disparate clinical technology systems to now becoming much more technologically advanced, both with the electronic healthcare platforms, but also much more importantly with the other infrastructure that's required to go with that. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment. There is a little bit of a disconnect though when we start to look at this in a little bit more detail, because many organisations seem to think that just because there is data within an EPR or an EHR system, that's all that's required. Now, if you look at the target diagram on the left, this is really split into this central part, which can be considered what is standard routine healthcare data that's recorded within EPR systems, through to the outer ring, which are all of the other types of data sources and potential technology types that are going to be gradually increasingly incorporated into healthcare. And there is a real need for this middle ring, which is how do we have both the infrastructure and the skills and the other components needed to actually maximize benefit from this data. So very simplistically speaking, and for the rest of this talk, I'm going to use the terms AI, machine learning in a very, very broad sense. This is simply meaning any kind of analytics where we can get new insights from the data. And essentially there's these three kind of buckets, if you like, that has generally been used around clinical decision support. So how do you get clinicians to make better decisions? Around patient decision support and operational decision support. And separate to this, there's the whole concept of really an extension of clinical decision support, which is how do we use the data we have to understand better disease processes, and within that really comes the drug discovery components. And there's only a couple of things we can do with these tools really. We can either use the existing data to predict what's going to happen, or we can use data to classify something into a group or a response versus not a response, etc. So in theory, it seems fine. In practice, there are these three elements that are required to get that benefit and insight, however. And one of these is, do you have the data that is required? And this doesn't just mean do you have the data somewhere in your system. It means do you have the data in a format and with all of the appropriate governance that is required and the other data that goes with it to make use of this to be able to do whatever is the task you want to do. Then there's the part of developing the actual, if you like, the algorithm or the model, which in many ways is the simplest part. And then fundamentally, the next issue is, do you have the infrastructure? Because there's no point just having the data. You need to be able to actually run these things at some kind of scale. So most of the effort to date in the world of healthcare AI in general has really been focused around things like efficiency. So I'm a pathologist. There's been lots of papers that have looked at digital pathology and radiology to say, could we do things that doctors do now, but with AI or ML systems, but just make them a bit more efficient and save time and make them safer, etc. That's not really what we're interested in. We want to be able to do something with the data that was simply not possible before. And I'm going to come on to some of the examples that are more relevant to the drug discovery as we move forward. But fundamentally, there are these three elements that are required to unlock this. The first is the part I'm going to focus most on today, which is around how we need to unlock this data by organizations sorting out their own data. Because there's no use just having data in an EPR system. It's all around the infrastructure that goes with that. The second thing is many of the tools that are required are already existing, but in other domains. So we don't necessarily need to reinvent all of these things in healthcare when we can use what has been done in other settings. And the last part, which in many ways is the most difficult of all, is we now need people with the appropriate skills to do this. And this is a major problem in the healthcare sector. So in its most simple term, the model we have to move towards is there needs to be some kind of platform that can ingest and store and manage data from a variety of sources, which may be omic data, maybe device data, EHR data, etc., but into one place. You need to be able to perform some kind of analysis on that data. And essentially, while this started very much off as a research perspective, to unlock what we all want to do with personalized medicine, this architecture is very much the same. Now, once these systems are set up, essentially it allows you to perform some data engineering to harmonize that data. So you can then start to present the data to various tools in a standardized way. So, for example, we can ingest all of our data from 20 years worth of patients who've attended the hospital, and then for any group of patients we like to look at, essentially we can investigate that data more or less live, because we know that the data has been harmonized. So a creatinine value that comes from a system 15 years ago versus a creatinine value from a different IT system now has all been harmonized to a common model. So you can start to do things at scale which were difficult to do before. It also means then that you can start to standardize the way that analysis is performed within the organization. And this means that essentially you're running things using reusable code, and you take a lot of the back-end work away from the individual researchers. And this means that your data analysis can be made significantly more transferable, but it can also be much more reproducible. So the other aspect is making much more use of the data sets, using some kind of data catalog or metadata catalog or data service, however you wish to do this according to FAIR principles. And it means that the data can be much more readily reused both within and outside your organization. So for example, you may have a data set that can be very well described, and now you've harmonized the data. And obviously there's lots of groups that have been trying to work on this, the Odyssey group, OMOP, etc. But the key thing is that organizations themselves also need to be aware of all of the harmonization and data engineering steps that they're doing, and to be able to document those within their service. So fundamentally, once you have this data in a standardized way that you and all of the people using your data can understand and access, there's various approaches that can be quite simply done in terms of things like identifying patients that have, for example, similar patterns of lab tests that may benefit from a particular treatment, for determining cohorts, and this may be on the basis of genomics, on the basis of a particular combination of phenotype characteristics, etc. You can start to do things like much more advanced trial design. And of course, perhaps one of the most important things is around the real world evidence used for surveillance. So you can investigate the data that is from real patients with multimorbidities and all of the other complications that are much more difficult to do in other elements. And being able to have this within some kind of trusted research environment, or DRE, has many advantages. And I won't go into the details now, but maybe we discuss. The key issue, however, with all of this is that there is a lot of work that has to be done around the data engineering part, not just defining things like what are the data elements going to be, but how are you going to define these, which ontologies, which terminologies, which formats, how are you going to deal with missing data, etc., etc. And unequivocally, the key group of people that are underestimated in this are the data engineers. So an absolutely fundamental part is around ensuring that the data engineering pipelines are really what's required. And this is now being increasingly recognized. This is from the Google team. This is quite famous now, but essentially showed that, you know, the actual code part of a machine learning project is probably 5% of the total resource. It's all of the other things that go with it. And similar to that, again, from a different team, but Google as well, they looked at what were the key elements that impact the outcome of what they called high stakes AI. So this is things like in aviation, self-driving cars, healthcare, etc. So where a decision may have a significant impact. And the single point which has by far the most effect on everything else was around the data collection, labeling and data engineering. Because if this is not done correctly, you can't often go back and fix this. And this was absolutely the fundamental point. The difficulty is everyone wants this data that has had a lot of effort and work being made into exactly the right format, being linked in the way, but no one really wants to do this work. And therefore, this is an evolving area of how do we start to solve this at scale. And a relatively simple example of where this data engineering has to be done at multiple areas is in the field of genomics. So if you look on the left-hand side of this slide, this is around all the bioinformatics pipelines that come out of sequencing. This has been really well standardized, and essentially there are very clear standards for how you represent a BAM file, a VNF file, etc. But when you come onto the right-hand side, a clinical person has to then interpret that result, and that interpreted result is then passed back into the electronic healthcare system. And almost universally, this is still done as essentially a letter, as a PDF or some other equivalent. It's done as a document. We don't have simple standardized ways of representing all of the elements that are in that report in a way that would make it useful for us to be able to do things at scale. So for most organizations, if you ask them, can you tell me all of the patients you've had with a lab test result that's between this and this value, they will be able to do that relatively straightforwardly. If you ask them, can you tell all the results where you've ever tested for this gene, whether there's a variant or not, they will have a lot of difficulty doing that just because of the way that the pipelines are currently set up. So this can be solved, and in fact this is some work that is going on in the UK and in parallel in many other places. This is based on the ISO and the FIRE standard for how you might represent all of the things that would be in a genomic report, but in a structured way using essentially a FIRE bundle. But you can see this is quite complex. This takes a skilled group of data engineers to do this. So this is an example of a made-up report, but that has all of the aspects in that would be in the final letter report, but color-coded now as to which of the tables we would have to extract that to. So this is a significant piece of data engineering. The other area that is going to become increasingly more of a problem to solve is that of this gold standard issue. So this was a really nice study from a couple of years ago now by Aldo Feisel's group at Imperial that basically looked at patients who are on intensive care, and got an AI system to predict what an intravenous fluid and a vasopressor dose and timing should be. And they essentially found that the more the deviation was from the ideal predicted, the worse the patient's outcome. So we now have a machine that is potentially predicting things better than a human. And this study was similarly a study that looked at predicting cardiac dysfunction, cardiac failure based on ECGs. And just in the bottom right hand corner, there's a blue line, which is the patients that went on at the end of the study who the doctors had thought the ECG was normal and the system thought the ECG was normal. You can see very few of them go on to develop cardiac failure, whereas actually the red line here are all patients that the doctor thought the ECG was completely normal and they didn't have any features of cardiac failure, but that the AI algorithm said already had cardiac failure. So you can see that, in fact, the system was correct in many of these cases. So these patients already had cardiac failure, but in a way that was so subtle, the human doctors didn't recognize them as such. So that's a massive problem, because if we start to only use the human doctor as our gold standard, this is going to be a fundamental problem for how we move forward with learning systems. And maybe we just... The last part of this really is all around the regulation that goes with it. So this is going to vary differently depending on which country you're in, but essentially everywhere will have some kind of flowchart that looks a bit like this. There'll be a whole range of regulatory bodies that set criteria as to what data is allowed to be used for what purpose, in terms of whether that's from a research study right through to getting a drug for real world use. So the question here is, if you don't understand this process and you do something wrong with your data engineering very early on, it's actually quite difficult to solve that any point later. So having an understanding of this process in wherever the study is being carried out is really important. And again, it's a highly controversial area, certainly in the UK, as to who should be doing what and what data can be used. And again, this may be something we can discuss at the end. The last part of this, which I touched on briefly earlier, is around the people. Who's going to do this work? So this is a massive issue in the UK, in that we have potentially now lots of interest in saying we must make use of our NHS data, but actually most of these jobs don't traditionally exist in healthcare organisations. So we don't have roles for data scientists, for example, and completely new skills are going to be required. So the Faculty of Clinical Informatics has now been set up in the UK to try and bring everyone together in this space, but these still don't exist as if you like, proper jobs in healthcare organisations. So when we appoint data scientists, we have to go to human resources and they say, oh, well, can we put them in as a laboratory technician, or can we put them in as admin? And this fundamentally has to change with professionalisation. So of course, one thing that can be done is we can start to train the next generation. So how do you get computer scientists, machine learning people to try and work in healthcare? And we've put a lot of effort really into trying to develop this clinical informatics research programs to try and encourage computer science in. But in order to actually get these into real world clinical practice, healthcare organisations also need to sort their own infrastructures out. So it's generally much easier to be able to carry out some research on data than it is to develop a tool, for example, and deploy that into the actual operational environment. And this whole the concept of having what's either been called a medical AI department or a clinical informatics unit is something that is going to have to be addressed. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Hopefully I've just given you a bit of an overview of some of the capabilities, but also some of the issues with using real world data for drug discovery. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.